The storm came without warning, the way the worst things always do. 1 hour, the sky above the Colorado Rockies was the color of old pewter, heavy and low but holding. The next, it cracked open. Wind tore through the pine corridors like something alive and furious, bending century-old trees as if they were made of paper, and the rain that fell was not gentle rain. It was the kind of rain that had weight to it, that hit exposed skin like thrown gravel, that soaked through wool and cotton, and determination in equal measure. Audra Voss had been walking for 2 hours when the storm found its full strength. She had not planned to be walking. She had planned to be on horseback, the brown mare she had purchased with the last $40 she had in this world, carrying her steadily through the mountain passes toward Leadville. But lightning had split a pine tree 30 feet to the left of the trail, and the mare had made her decision in the same instant. The thunder followed, and no amount of pulling on the reins had changed that decision. The horse was gone now, somewhere back down the mountain, and Audra was here, moving through a darkness that was arriving too early because the storm had swallowed the afternoon sun whole. She was running a fever. She had been running it for 3 days, though she had done her best not to acknowledge that fact. A doctor in Denver had pressed his fingers against her throat, listened to her chest, and given her a small bottle of laudanum, with instructions to rest and take fluids. She had taken the laudanum. She had not rested. There was no time for rest, not when the letter from Leadville had arrived, not when she had read the words written in a stranger's careful hand, because Fletcher could not hold a pen himself, not when those words had described her brother's condition in the careful neutral language that people use when they are trying not to cause panic but are failing. Fletcher Voss had broken his leg in a tunnel collapse at the silver mine where he worked. That was the first letter. The second letter, which arrived 4 days after the first, said the bone had not set properly. It said there was infection. It said the doctor in Leadville was doing everything he could. The third letter never came, but the silence that filled the space where it should have been was louder than anything Audra had ever heard. So she had bought the mare and ignored the warnings about the passes in October, and started up the mountain alone. She was by any reasonable measure doing something foolish. She knew that. She had known it when she was doing it. But reason had its limits, and one of those limits was the threshold where the only family you had left in the world was lying in a mining town boarding house with a badly set bone and an infection that a stranger's careful handwriting had not quite managed to make sound manageable. Fletcher was 20 years old. He had their father's recklessness and their mother's stubborn optimism, and absolutely none of the caution that experience was supposed to teach a person. He had left St. Louis the previous year, chasing rumors of silver in the Colorado mountains, and Audra had argued against it with everything she had, and he had listened to her with the respectful attention of someone who had already made up his mind and was simply waiting for the conversation to end. She had let him go because there was nothing else she could do. And now she was on a mountain in a storm with a fever that was doing something unpleasant to the edges of her vision, and the trail had narrowed to something she was not entirely certain was still a trail, and she was putting one foot in front of the other because that was the only thing left to do. Her mother had given her the sewing box on her deathbed. It was a small thing, rosewood and brass, no larger than a hardback Bible, and it held needles and thread and a small pair of scissors with handles shaped like a crane in flight. It had belonged to Audra's grandmother before that, and her great-grandmother before that, and her mother had pressed it into Audra's hands with the particular urgency of a woman who understood she was running out of time to give things to people she loved. Audra carried it in her traveling bag. She had carried it across 2 states. She was carrying it now through the rain and the dark and the fever. And when the world tilted at the edges and her legs threatened to stop working, she thought about the weight of it against her hip, and she kept moving. The fever had a sound inside her head. It was not words exactly, it was more like the constant low hum of a telegraph wire in wind, a vibration that sat just behind her eyes and made everything feel slightly unreal, slightly removed from her as if she were watching herself walk through the storm from somewhere just above and behind her own body. She stumbled on a route she should have seen, caught herself against a boulder. The stone scraped her palms, and the pain was distant, muffled, the way sounds are muffled when you are underwater. She stood with her hands against the rock and breathed. In St. Louis, she had been a seamstress, a good one. Her hands were skilled and her eye was precise, and she could look at a bolt of fabric and see the dress that was waiting inside it, the way some people claim to see figures hidden in clouds. She had worked from before dawn until after dark most days, sitting close to the window to use the natural light because candles and oil lamps were expensive and she was always saving money. Saving money to bring Fletcher back from Colorado before Colorado killed him. She had been too slow. Now she pushed herself off the boulder and kept walking. The light appeared when she had stopped expecting to find anything. It was not large. It was not even particularly bright by the standards of light in a room with other people in it. But against the darkness of the mountain and the darkness of the storm and the darkness that was beginning to creep in at the edges of her own consciousness, it was the most significant thing she had ever seen in her life, warm and amber and steady. It sat in what she gradually understood to be a window, which meant it was attached to a cabin, which meant there was a structure with walls and a roof and something burning inside it to produce warmth. Audra fixed her eyes on it. She was not a woman given to religious experience. Her faith was quiet and private and mostly expressed through the daily actions of trying to treat people decently and do the work in front of her without complaint. But in that moment, looking at that small amber light through the rain and the dark with her fever humming behind her eyes and her legs losing their argument with gravity, she felt something she could only describe as answered. She had been praying, she realized, not formally, not with words, but somewhere underneath all the deliberate focus on putting one foot in front of the other, some part of her had been sending something upward into the storm, some wordless and desperate asking. The light was a response. She moved toward it. The distance was farther than it looked. The trail wound and doubled, and the trees pressed close on either side, and twice she had to stop and find the light again, because it had disappeared behind the tree line. But it always reappeared. She fixed her eyes on it each time and moved toward it, and gradually the shape of the cabin resolved itself out of the darkness. It was larger than she expected, built from thick logs that looked like they had been chosen and placed with serious intention rather than convenience. The cabin sat solid and permanent against the mountain behind it, as if it had grown there rather than been constructed. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and under the eaves she could make out neat stacks of firewood split and organized with the kind of methodical care that spoke of a person who took the practicalities of survival seriously. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the rain. Audra's legs gave out at the bottom of the porch steps. She did not decide to fall. Her body simply stopped honoring her instructions the way it had been threatening to do for the last hour, and she went down onto the wooden steps with a jarring impact that sent pain shooting up through her hip and her hands and briefly cut through the fever haze with something sharp and clarifying. She lay there with the rain still hitting her back, and she understood clearly and without any drama that she had reached the end of what she was capable of on her own. She lifted her hand and knocked against the lowest step. The sound was nothing. The storm swallowed it completely. She tried again, scraped her knuckles against the wood hard enough to feel it, hard enough to produce something that might in a quiet room have been audible, and she found what was left of her voice. "Please," she said. The word came out barely above a whisper. "Please help me." She did not know if anyone heard it, inside the cabin, Cormac Hale heard it. He had heard the knock too, or rather he had felt it, some variation in the rhythm of the storm that his body registered before his mind caught up. He was sitting at the workbench in the corner, a steel trap in his hands that needed a new spring, and he had gone absolutely still when the sound reached him. Not the stillness of a person who is calm, the stillness of a person who has learned through long and difficult experience that stillness is the first and most important response to the unexpected. There was a lamp burning in the window. He always kept a lamp in the window when storms came through. He had started doing it the second winter he spent on the mountain after he found a man half frozen to death in the tree line, 200 yards from the cabin. A prospector who had been wandering for 6 hours in a blizzard and had survived only because Cormac had gone out to check his woodpile and heard something that was not the wind. He kept the lamp burning since then, and occasionally someone found it, and he would feed them and let them sleep on the floor and send them on their way in the morning. He did not enjoy those encounters. That was the honest truth of it, the truth he had spent 8 years on this mountain making peace with. He was not good at people. He had not been good at people before the war exactly, but he had been functional, had been capable of the ordinary exchanges that social life required. After the war, he had lost even that. The noise of towns made his body respond as if to threat. The proximity of strangers produced in him a vigilance that was exhausting to sustain and impossible to explain. So he had come to the mountains. The mountain did not need him to explain himself. The mountain did not look at his hands and wonder what they had done. The mountain simply was in all its indifferent and enormous beauty, and it required from him only competence and attention and the willingness to learn its moods, and those things he had in abundance. He had been here 8 years. He had come in the spring of 1875, years after the war ended, after several more years of trying to make himself fit into the life he had returned to, and failing at it in ways that were quiet but thorough. He had built the cabin that first summer, working alone from before sunrise until after dark, the physical labor a kind of medication for something that had no other treatment. He had spent the first winter nearly starving because he had not prepared enough, and he had learned from that, and every winter since had been better. He was 35 years old. He was by most measures capable and strong and self-sufficient. He was also alone in a way that had long since stopped feeling like a choice and had started feeling like a fact, like the altitude or the cold, simply a condition of the place where he lived. When he heard the sound at the door, his first instinct was to extinguish the lamp. He had done that twice before in the early years, when the instinct towards solitude was sharper and less examined than it had become. Someone would knock, and something in him would go cold and closed, and he would sit in the dark and wait for them to leave. And they always did. And afterward, he would feel something that was not quite guilt, but was adjacent to it, a low, uncomfortable awareness that he had perhaps not behaved as a man ought to behave. He stood now with his hand near the lamp, and he did not extinguish it. He stood there for a long moment longer than he would have been able to explain if anyone had asked him to. The storm was loud, and the knock had been almost nothing, and maybe he had imagined it. That was possible. The mountain had its sounds, and sometimes in the worst weather, those sounds arranged themselves into patterns that resembled human voices or human footsteps or human hands against wood. And then he heard it. One word, please. It came through the storm and through the wall and through 8 years of deliberate solitude, and it hit him somewhere in the chest with a force that was entirely disproportionate to its volume. Because he had heard that word before. He had heard it in Georgia in 1864 on a cold November afternoon when the sky was thick with smoke from things that were burning, because he and the men around him had been ordered to burn them. He had heard it from a woman standing in front of a farmhouse with 3 children pressed against her skirts, her voice carrying that single word across the yard toward the soldiers who were preparing to take that last thing she had. He had not helped her. He had not helped her, and he had been paying for it ever since in the currency of sleepless nights and a solitude he had convinced himself was penance. The word came through the storm again, or maybe it was the memory of it, and Cormac Hale moved his hand from the lamp and crossed to the door and opened it. The woman on his porch steps was small and soaking wet and barely conscious. She was lying half on the steps and half off them, one hand raised as if she had been knocking on the wood, and even in the poor light he could see the flush of fever across her cheekbones, the particular brightness in her eyes that had nothing to do with health. He was down the steps before he had made any conscious decision to move. She was lighter than she should have been, or perhaps he was simply stronger than the occasion required, and he lifted her without difficulty, one arm under her shoulders and one under her knees, and carried her up the steps and through the door of the cabin and into the warmth. He laid her on the bed along the near wall. He pulled the wet cloak away from her shoulders with hands that were careful and impersonal. He pressed the back of one hand against her forehead and felt the heat radiating off her skin and understood immediately that this was serious. "Can you hear me?" he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, unused to the effort of directing itself at another person. "What is your name?" Her eyes focused on him with visible effort. They were gray, her eyes the particular clear gray of creek water over limestone, and even with the fever in them, they were sharp. "Audra," she said, Audra Voss." "Cormac Hale," he said, "you are safe here." He moved away then, crossing to the shelves along the far wall, where he kept his medical supplies organized with the same methodical care as everything else in the cabin. 8 years alone in the mountains had taught him to be his own doctor, and he had learned well partly from books and partly from necessity and partly from the particular attention that a man pays to knowledge when he understands that ignorance in these matters is not inconvenient but fatal. He gathered what he needed, a basin water from the pot, warming at the edge of the fair strips of clean cloth, the willow bark tincture he had prepared in September when the bark was at its best. He returned to the bed. She had not lost consciousness, which was a good sign. She was watching him move around the cabin with those sharp gray eyes, taking inventory of him in a way that he recognized because it was what he did himself, what the mountain had taught him. You observed, you assessed, you made decisions based on what you actually saw rather than what you assumed. "Your clothes are wet through," he said. "They need to come off." He said it the way he would have stated any other medical fact without apology, but also without any suggestion beyond the clinical. Her face colored slightly, which meant she had enough blood in the right places to blush, which meant she was not as far gone as he had feared. "I can manage," she said. "I will turn my back," he said. "Call out if you need help." He turned to the fireplace and began building up the already substantial fire, adding wood from the stack beside the hearth, not watching her, giving her what privacy the small cabin allowed. He heard her struggling with the buttons of her dress. He heard her stop. He heard silence, and then, "I cannot do it. I am sorry." He turned back. There was no embarrassment in his manner as he returned to the bed and knelt beside it. He was a man who had done practical things under difficult circumstances for most of his adult life, and this was a practical thing under difficult circumstances, and he approached it as such. "No need to apologize," he said. "You are very ill." He helped her out of the wet layers with efficient care, keeping his eyes on the task rather than on her, and wrapped her immediately in the heaviest blanket he owned, thick wool, that had kept him warm through 3 particularly brutal mountain winters. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, even through the fabric. She sighed when the warmth reached her. Some of the tension that had been holding her body rigid went out of her at once, and she seemed to settle into the bed like something that had been fighting for a long time against the direction it was falling. "Better?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "thank you." He dipped a cloth into the basin of cooled water and pressed it to her forehead. She drew in a sharp breath at the shock of it. "I know," he said. "Breathe through it." He worked methodically the way he did everything. Forehead, temples, the sides of her neck, behind her ears. Cool water against fever skin. His hands moved with a gentleness that was partly training and partly something he would not have been able to name, some instinct that activated in the presence of something fragile that had already taken considerable punishment. She did not speak for a while. She lay with her eyes half closed and let him work, and he found that the silence was not uncomfortable, the way silences with people usually were for him. It was simply quiet, the two of them in the warm cabin, with the storm working itself out against the walls and the fire cracking, and his hands doing the steady work of trying to pull her fever down. After a time, she spoke. "I need to get to Leadville," she said. "My brother is there. He was injured in the mines." Cormac's hands did not stop moving, but something in him went quiet in a different way. "How injured?" "A tunnel collapse," she said. "He broke his leg. The bone did not set properly, and there was infection." She paused. "The last letter I received said the doctor was doing what he could." "When did you receive that letter?" 3 weeks ago." He said nothing for a moment. He rinsed the cloth in the basin and returned it to her forehead. "I heard about an accident in the Leadville mines," he said, choosing his words carefully. "From a man who trades furs. He passes through twice a year, and he stopped here perhaps 2 weeks ago." Her eyes opened all the way. "What did he say?" Cormac looked at her directly. She was watching him with those clear gray eyes, and he understood that she was not a woman who wanted to be protected from information. She wanted the truth, and she wanted it delivered straight. "He mentioned a young man from St. Louis," Cormac said. "Name of Voss. He said the situation was serious. He said the physician in Leadville had," he paused, choosing the word with care, "had done what he could." The meaning of that particular phrase in that particular context was clear to both of them. Audra's jaw tightened. Her hands, which had been resting open at her sides, closed into fists around the edge of the blanket. "How long ago did he pass through?" 14 days. "And you knew this," she said, "when you brought me inside. When you were treating me, you already knew about Fletcher." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. He held that look and did not look away, because he had said what he had said, and he was not going to apologize for the calculation behind it. He had known she was feverish. He had known that delivering that information to a woman in the grip of high fever, who was already exhausted and alone, would serve no useful purpose and might cause real harm. He expected anger. He had anticipated it, had been prepared for it. What he had not anticipated was the slow nod she gave him, deliberate and considered, as if she were processing something and had arrived at a conclusion that surprised her. "You were protecting me," she said, "from information I could not have acted on." "I was waiting until you could hear it properly," he said. Another silence. "That was kind of you," she said finally, and the words were simple and direct, without qualification, and something about them hit him in a way he was not prepared for. Not because he was unused to kindness. He had provided it to others in his careful and limited way throughout his years on the mountain. He had simply grown unaccustomed to receiving it. "The man said his name was Fletcher," Cormac said. The fur trader mentioned the name. "Yes," she said. "Fletcher Voss. He is 20 years old and he has no more sense than God gave a June bug, and he is the only person left in the world who belongs to me, and I need to get to him. You are not going anywhere tonight, Cormac said, or tomorrow in all likelihood. You are running a fever that would put a grown man flat on his back. Trying to travel in this condition would kill you before you reach the first pass. He might not have 2 days. He has survived this long. 2 more days will not change the fundamental situation either way, and it may change yours considerably. He met her eyes. You cannot help him if you are dead, Audra Voss. She looked at him again with those careful eyes. Then she closed them, and he watched some internal struggle work itself out in the lines of her face. You are right, she said. It sounded as though it cost her something to say it. I know, he said. Sleep if you can. Your body needs the rest to fight this fever. She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she might have already drifted. Then she spoke again, her voice lower now, approaching sleep. You keep a lamp in the window during storms, she said. I saw it through the trees. I thought I was hallucinating. Not a hallucination, he said. Why do you do it, the lamp? He considered not answering, considered giving her some abbreviated version that was true but incomplete, the kind of answer that closes a conversation rather than opening it. Instead, he said, because someone might need to find their way here. She made a small sound that might have been understanding or might have been the beginning of sleep. He poured a measure of willow bark tincture into a cup and added water, and he helped her drink it, one hand behind her shoulders to support her, watching to make sure she could swallow without difficulty. She drank it dutifully, made a small face at the bitterness, and let him lower her back against the pillow. Fletcher is impulsive, she said quietly, as if continuing a conversation he had not known they were having. He always has been. Our father was the same way. It used to frighten me when I was young, watching them both go headlong at things without looking at what was on the other side. After father died, I thought Fletcher might settle, but grief does not always make people careful. Sometimes it makes them run faster. Cormac said nothing. He was sitting in the chair beside the bed now, and he was watching the fire rather than her. Our father died in 1866, she continued. He came home from the war in one piece, more or less. But something was different in him. He did not talk about it, and we did not ask, because you could see from looking at him that the asking would not be kind. He died 2 years later. Heart, the doctor said. She paused. I do not think it was his heart that gave out exactly. I think it was something else that does not have a medical name. Cormac was very still. Our mother got sick not long after, Audra said. Consumption. It took her almost a year. After that, it was just Fletcher and me, and then Fletcher left, and then it was just me. She said this without self-pity, simply as an accounting of facts. I am a seamstress. I am good at it. I have been saving money to bring him back to St. Louis before Colorado finished what it started. He does not want to come back, Cormac said. It was not a question. No, she said. He writes that he is on the verge of something, always on the verge. The next claim, the next strike, the next chance. He sounds exactly like my father. A pause. I used to be angry with my father for being that way. Now I just miss him. The fire cracked and settled. The storm pressed against the cabin walls and found no purchase. Get some rest, Cormac said. I will be here. I do not mean to impose on you, she said. You were not expecting company. No, he agreed, but that is a separate thing from whether you are welcome. She was quiet after that, and within a few minutes her breathing shifted into the slower rhythm of sleep. Cormac sat with his arms resting on his knees and watched the fire and listened to the storm work itself out overhead. He had not spoken that many consecutive sentences to another person in a very long time. The cabin felt different with another person breathing in it. He turned that observation over in his mind without trying to do anything with it, the way he turned over stones by the creek in spring, looking at what was underneath without any particular expectation of what he would find. The woman on his bed had come through a mountain storm with a fever that should have stopped her a mile from his door, carrying nothing but a small bag and a determination so concentrated it had apparently substituted for body heat. She had listened to difficult information without falling apart. She had assessed him with clear eyes and arrived at conclusions that were, as far as he could tell, accurate. She had said he was kind, without irony or exaggeration, simply as an observation. He could not remember the last time someone had called him kind. He was not sure he believed he deserved the word. That was a different matter. That was a matter that went back 14 years to a cold November afternoon in Georgia, when a woman had said please, and he had done nothing, and the sound of it had followed him every day since, and the mountain had been the place he had come to carry the sound, without driving himself entirely out of his mind. He sat in the chair beside the bed for 2 hours watching the fire, and occasionally checking on Audra Voss until he was satisfied that her breathing was steady and her color was somewhat better. And then he returned to his workbench and the trap that needed a new spring, and he worked in silence while the storm moved east and the rain thinned to nothing and the cabin breathed around him. Outside, the mountain was dark and enormous and completely indifferent. Inside, the lamp burned in the window still. The fever came back in the dead hours before dawn. Cormac was not asleep when it happened. He rarely slept deeply anymore, and on nights when the weather was disturbed, he barely slept at all. He was in the chair, half present and half somewhere in the middle distance that his mind went, when his body demanded rest but refused the vulnerability of actual unconsciousness. And he heard the change in her breathing before he saw the change in her. He was at the bedside in seconds. She was shaking badly, the kind of shaking that came from the body trying to produce heat while simultaneously being consumed by it. Her face was white and quiet, and her eyes were open but not focused, and she was making a small sound in the back of her throat that she was clearly not aware she was making. "I am here," he said. "I have you." He stripped away the sweat-soaked blankets and replaced them with fresh ones from the chest at the foot of the bed. He brought the basin and cloths again and worked with quiet efficiency, cool water against fever skin, methodical and steady. She shook harder, and he covered her with the fur blanket from his own bed, the heaviest thing in the cabin. It was not enough. He recognized this stage. He had seen it before in his own body during a fever the second winter he spent on the mountain, when he had understood with cold clarity that he might die in this cabin if the fever did not break, and had done the only thing available to him. He had wrapped himself in every warm thing he owned, and had gotten through the night minute by minute until morning, found him drenched and exhausted but still breathing. He sat on the edge of the bed. "I am going to move you," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, directing it at her, even though he was not sure she could hear him properly. "You need more warmth than the blankets can give. This is not improper. This is what you need to get through the night." He wrapped the fur blanket around her and gathered her against his side, his back against the cabin wall, one arm around her shoulders. She shook violently against him for a long few minutes, and he held steady and let his body do what bodies do, which is produce heat. Gradually, by degrees, the shaking eased. She was not unconscious. He knew that because she spoke. "Tell me about the mountains," she said. Her voice was very small, barely above the sound of the fire. "Tell me what you love about them." He had not been asked that before, not in those words. Passing travelers occasionally asked practical questions about the terrain about trail conditions, about distance to the next settlement. No one had asked what he loved. I love the honesty of them, he said after a moment. The mountain will kill you if you are careless, but it does so without malice. It simply is what it is, and it requires you to be what you actually are rather than what you imagine yourself to be. He paused. There is something restful in that. Restful, she repeated softly as if tasting the word. Most of what exhausts a person in the company of other people is the performance, he said. The effort of presenting a version of yourself that will be acceptable. The mountain does not require a performance. It requires competence and attention. Those I can provide. She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she had fallen asleep. Then she said, "Why do you stay here alone?" He had anticipated the question. It was the question people always asked when they asked questions at all. "Because up here," he said, "the only person I can damage is myself." He felt her turn her head slightly against his shoulder, felt her attention sharpen even through the fever, even in the dark. But she did not ask the follow-up question that the statement invited. She simply held the words, and after a time her breathing slowed and became deeper, and she slept. Cormac stayed where he was. The fire burned down to coals, and he leaned forward carefully, not waking her, and added 2 more pieces of wood and settled back. Outside, the storm was entirely gone, replaced by the particular silence that follows a storm in the mountains. That total and enormous quiet that feels not like the absence of sound, but like the presence of something vast and unnameable. He sat with the sleeping woman against his side, and the mountain quiet outside the walls, and the coals glowing orange in the dark. He had said more this evening than he had said in the last several months combined. He considered that. He considered the way she had listened, not waiting for him to finish so she could speak, but actually listening, the way she had received the information about Fletcher with grief, but not collapsed, the way she had said, "You were protecting me," with a directness that contained no accusation. He considered the fact that when she had said, "The only person left in the world who belongs to me," he had understood exactly what she meant. Not because his own situation was the same, but because he had chosen a version of it, deliberately had constructed a life in which belonging to no one, and having no one belong to him was the point, was the whole architecture of his daily existence. He had not until this moment thought to wonder whether that architecture was a home or a prison. The lamp burned in the window all night, even though the storm was gone and no one was out in the dark who needed to find it. Cormac did not extinguish it. He sat in the deep quiet of the mountains with a feverish woman asleep against his shoulder, and thought about doors and about what it means to open one, and about the single word that can be said in the right voice at the right moment and travel through 8 years of deliberate solitude like a key turning in a lock that was never meant to stay locked forever. Dawn came slowly, the way dawn comes in the mountains, not all at once, but in layers, gray lightening to pearl, lightening to the first thin gold along the eastern peaks. Audra Voss slept through most of it. Cormac eased her back against the pillow when the light was sufficient to do so without waking her, tucked the blankets around her carefully, and built up the fire. He put water on to heat and went out briefly to check the state of the trail after the storm, noting where trees had come down, where the mud was deep, calculating distances and conditions with the automatic competence of a man who had been reading this particular landscape for 8 years. When he came back in, she was awake. Not the confused fever, heavy waking of the night before, but genuinely awake, those gray eyes clear and alert, watching him cross the room. "The fever broke," he said. "It had some time in the last hours of the night. Her color was better, and the brightness in her eyes was the brightness of a person paying attention rather than a person burning." "I know," she said. I feel like I was dragged behind a horse, but I can think again. That is progress, he said. She tried to sit up. He helped her arranging the pillows behind her back, bringing her a cup of water that she drank with a gratitude that was almost painful to witness, because it was the gratitude of someone who had not been certain hours earlier that they would still be here to drink water. How long? She asked. You slept perhaps 5 hours straight after the fever broke. Before that, on and off through the night. She nodded, processing this. You stayed with me, she said. Through the night. Yes, you did not have to do that. No, he agreed, but the fever was serious and you needed someone to watch for signs that it was worsening rather than breaking. He said it plainly without the softening of false modesty. It was true and it was what he had done and it required no decoration. She looked at him for a moment with those careful eyes. Fletcher is still in Leadville, she said, not as accusation or urgency, simply as fact reestablishing itself in the morning light. Yes. I will be well enough to travel in a day or two, you said. Perhaps 2 days, he said. Perhaps 3. It depends on how your body responds. Then I will rest today, she said, as if making a business decision rather than conceding to physical necessity. And tomorrow we will discuss the route to Leadville. He said. I am going to need a guide, she said. I lost my horse, and I would not find the trail again on my own, not in this terrain. She met his eyes directly. I will not ask you to come into town, but if you could take me as far as the trail is passable, I would be grateful. He had not said he would go. He had also not said he would not. He turned to the fire and the pot of water that had come to a boil, and he began making breakfast, and he did not answer her directly, and she did not press him, and the cabin held them both in the long, careful quiet of two people who had each in their own way learned that the most important things rarely needed to be said immediately. Outside, the mountain stood in the thin October sunlight, enormous and still, and keeping its own counsel. And in the window, though, it was daylight now, and the storm was long past, the lamp still burned. The second day passed the way convalescence always does, slowly, and with a particular quality of suspension, as if time itself had agreed to move at a gentler pace, while the body conducted its necessary repairs. Audra slept through most of the morning. When she woke, Cormac was at the workbench in the corner, his back to her, working on something she could not immediately identify. The cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the venison broth that sat warming at the edge of the hearth. Gray light came through the single window, clean and cold after the storm. She lay still for a few minutes and simply observed. Cormac Hale was not what she had expected to find at the end of that trail. She was not certain what she had expected exactly. Some weathered, diminished figure, perhaps the way men who lived alone in remote places were often described, shrunk by isolation and the absence of human contact into something smaller than their original dimensions. What she had found instead was a man who occupied his space with a quiet completeness, who moved through the cabin with an economy of motion that spoke not of constriction, but of total competence within his particular domain. His hands were large and scarred, and they handled the tools on the workbench with the same unhurried precision they had used when cooling her fever the night before. He had not spoken much since morning, but the silence he produced was not hostile. It was simply the silence of a man who did not generate noise for its own sake, who had decided long ago that words were a resource to be used deliberately rather than spent freely. She watched him work and thought about Fletcher. 14 days since the fear trader had passed through. 14 days since someone with direct knowledge of the situation had been close enough to this mountain to provide information. In 14 days, many things could happen. Some of them were things she would not allow herself to name in the daylight hours because naming them gave them weight and substance, and she needed to travel. And she could not travel if she was weighted with the wrong kind of fear. Fletcher was 20 years old and stubborn as a mule in wet clay, and those qualities which had caused her considerable frustration over the years were the qualities she was counting on now. She pushed herself up to sitting. Cormac turned immediately as if he had been aware of her position the entire time, which she suspected he had. "You should eat," he said. "I agree," she said. "I am going to help." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to understand as his version of assessment, a brief but thorough inventory of the evidence before him. And then he nodded once, and that was that. She was not at full strength. That was obvious, and she did not pretend otherwise. Her legs were less reliable than she would have preferred, and her head swam slightly when she stood too quickly, and her hands had a faint tremor that was the fever's parting gift. But she could stand. She could move around the cabin. She could ladle broth into bowls and slice bread from the loaf Cormac had produced from somewhere, and set the table with the simple, sturdy implements that were the cabin's only concession to domestic civilization. They ate together without ceremony, sitting across from each other at the small table near the window. "I need to understand the route to Leadville," she said when the first edge of hunger had been addressed. "Distance, terrain, how long on foot?" "Approximately 20 miles," he said. "The first 8 are mountain trail, steep in sections, exposed in others. After that, the terrain flattens and the trail becomes a proper road. 2 days walking given your current condition. 1 day riding, but we have only one horse." "You have a horse?" "Yes." "Then she said. He looked at her. "You said we," he said. It was the same word she had used the morning before, and she heard the echo of it, the unresolved question she had set down and left there. "I did," she said, "and you did not say no." "I did not say yes." "No," she agreed, "you did not." She set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "I am not going to ask you to come back to the world, Cormac. I understand that the world and you have arrived at a particular arrangement, and I have no standing to interfere with it. But my brother is 20 miles from here, and he may be dying, and I do not know this terrain, and I cannot afford to get lost or turned around or caught on the wrong side of a pass when the next storm comes through." She paused. "I am not asking for more than you are able to give. I am asking for the specific thing that you are uniquely positioned to provide." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it, that was doing work. "One trip," she said, "then you come back to your mountain, and I do not trouble you again." Cormac was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the table rather than at her, and she could see something working in his expression, some internal negotiation that she did not have access to and did not try to enter. "We leave the day after tomorrow," he said, "if your fever does not return tonight." "Agreed," she said. She did not allow herself to show the relief she felt, because showing it would have made the moment about her gratitude rather than his decision, and she understood intuitively that Cormac Hale was a man for whom being owed something was more uncomfortable than being asked for something. The rest of that day she spent on purposeful recovery. She walked the length of the cabin a dozen times, rebuilding the relationship between her legs and the ground beneath them. She ate everything Cormac put in front of her. She slept again in the afternoon briefly and woke feeling closer to herself than she had since Denver. In the evening, they sat by the fire and she asked him about the mountain. Not the logistical mountain of trails and passes and weather patterns, though she wanted that information too, and got it delivered in the precise and useful way that Cormac delivered all information. She asked about the mountain he had described the night before, the honest mountain, the one that required you to be what you actually were. He told her about the first winter, how he had underestimated the provisions required and spent 3 months eating less than his body needed, rationing, with rigid discipline, losing weight. He could not afford to lose and spending every calorie of reserve on keeping warm. How he had learned from it with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the same mistake twice in these mountains was not a mistake but a choice. How every winter since had been better, more prepared, more efficient, a steady accumulation of hard-won knowledge that now lived in his body as naturally as breathing. He told her about the grizzly he had tracked for 3 days after finding it with a leg caught in a poorly maintained trap left by a careless hunter bear. How he had followed the bear not to finish killing it, which would have been the simpler thing, but because he could not leave an animal in that kind of pain if there was anything to be done about it. How on the third day he had found the bear in a meadow unable to move and had done what needed doing as quickly and humanely as he could, and had sat with it afterward in the way that a person sometimes needs to sit with something after. He told her about the first elk he had seen in the valley below the cabin in the spring of his first year, a bull with an antler spread that seemed impossible and probably was not, but still. How he had stood absolutely motionless for 20 minutes, watching it move through the meadow grass, and how that had felt like something significant, though he could not have said then and could not say now exactly what it signified. Only that it had mattered and continued to matter in the way that beautiful things continue to matter long after you have stopped standing in front of them. She listened to all of it. She noticed that he spoke about the mountain the way some people spoke about a relationship, with the particular mixture of respect and understanding and occasional frustration that came from long and genuine acquaintance. He knew this place. He had learned it the way you only learn something when you cannot afford to be wrong about it. She also noticed what he did not say. He did not talk about loneliness. He had mentioned it the night before briefly and not returned to it. He did not talk about what he had left behind or what the world below the mountain contained that he was not part of. He spoke entirely in the present tense of his life here, as if the before of it were a separate country whose language he had mostly forgotten. She filed all of this away in the careful internal ledger she kept on people, the one she had been keeping since childhood, since she understood that reading a person accurately was a practical skill as important as any other. The fever did not return that night. In the morning, Cormac began preparing for the journey. He moved through the cabin with a quiet purposefulness that she recognized as the particular energy of a man who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. He checked his rifle and pistol, not with any show of drama, but with the methodical attention of someone for whom these items were tools that needed to be in working order, in the same way that a saw or an axe needed to be in working order. He packed provisions into a leather saddlebag, flour and dried meat and coffee, and the various small bottles and pouches of herbs that he apparently considered essential equipment. He assessed the horse, a compact gray mountain breed, with an intelligent eye and the particular steady disposition of an animal that had learned the terrain it worked, and pronounced it ready. Audra, meanwhile, was doing her own preparing. Her traveling dress was beyond salvage, the rain and the fever and the mud of the trail having combined to produce something that was technically still fabric, but was no longer functional clothing in any meaningful sense. Cormac had, without commentary, produced a pair of canvas trousers and a heavy flannel shirt from a chest at the foot of the bed, both obviously his own and therefore both obviously too large for her. She belted the trousers with a strip of leather he provided and rolled up the cuffs of both, and found to her own surprise that the result was not merely tolerable, but was in some ways preferable to what she had been wearing before. The freedom of movement was remarkable. She had worn corsets and petticoats and the full apparatus of women's traveling dresses her entire adult life, and she had never once thought to question this because it was simply what one wore. It was the water one swam in, and you did not typically notice water. Standing in canvas trousers in a mountain cabin, with her fever broken and Leadville 20 miles away, she noticed the water. She noticed its absence. She noticed that without it, she could breathe more deeply and walk more easily, and was in the purely mechanical sense better equipped for the task at hand. She put her mother's sewing box in the center of the pack. They set out mid-morning, Audra on the horse and Cormac on foot beside her. She had offered to walk so they could take turns on the horse, and he had looked at her with that brief assessing expression and said nothing, which she had understood to mean that the suggestion was not going to be implemented because she was not yet strong enough, and he was, and that was the simple end of it. The mountain in the aftermath of the storm was extraordinary. Every surface that could hold water held it, and the light came through the pines in columns and struck those surfaces, and the whole mountain glittered with a cold and particular beauty that had nothing soft about it, but was beautiful nonetheless. The air smelled of pine resin and wet stone and the faint, distant, metallic quality that meant snow was not far off in the higher elevations. Cormac moved alongside the horse with a ground-covering stride that required no apparent effort, his eyes on the trail ahead, occasionally glancing at the sky or the tree line in the way of someone reading information that was not visible to Audra, but was clearly legible to him. They walked in silence for the first hour, not uncomfortable silence, working silence, the kind that existed between people who had something in common to attend to and were attending to it. Then she said, "Tell me what happened in the war." He did not stop walking. "You said last night that the only person you can damage up here is yourself," she said. "I have been thinking about that since you said it, and I think if you are going to walk into my brother's life, if you are going to be present for what happens when we get to Leadville, I need to know who you are. The whole of it, not just the part that is willing to be seen." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Do you know about Sherman's march?" "I know the broad outline," as she said. "The march through Georgia, the destruction." "It was the autumn of 1864, he said. "I was 21 years old. I had been in the Army for 3 years. I was not idealistic anymore, not the way I had been at 18 when I enlisted. But I was still convinced that what we were doing was righteous, that the scale of what we were destroying was justified by what we were trying to end." He was looking at the trail ahead, his voice steady and uninflected, the voice of someone reciting something that has been recited internally many times. "We were burning everything in our path. Military targets, yes, but also farms and houses and mills and barns. The instruction was to leave nothing that could support the Confederate armor or the Confederate economy. The instruction was followed." A pause. "I followed it." Audra said nothing. The horse moved steadily beneath her. "There was a farm," Cormac said. "Small place, well kept. A woman came out when we arrived and she had 3 children with her, the oldest perhaps 8 or 9 years old, and the youngest barely walking. Her husband had died earlier in the war. She told us that not as a plea for sympathy, but as a fact she thought might be relevant. A widow with 3 children and a small farm and nothing else." He stopped speaking for a moment. The trail curved around a large boulder and came out on a section that looked east, and the valley below was visible for a moment, impossibly far down, the trees turning gold and amber along the lower elevations. "She asked us not to burn the house," he said. "She said without it, they would have nowhere to go when winter came. She said it without tears, without hysteria. She was a practical woman. She stated the case as clearly as she could. He paused. And then when she understood we were not going to change course, she said one word. She said, please. The word landed in the mountain air with a weight that was out of proportion to its size. I had the authority to redirect my unit, Cormac said. I could have told them the property had already been checked. I could have found some reason, some justification that would have satisfied the requirement without destroying what that woman had. I knew this at the time. I was aware of the options available to me. He walked several paces without speaking. I did nothing. The house burned. The woman stood in the yard with her children and watched it burn, and I watched her watch it. And then we moved on because there was more ground to cover before dark. Audra let the silence hold for a moment before she spoke. Why are you telling me this exactly as it happened? She said. Without the softening, most people would find a way to soften it. Because you asked for the whole of it, he said. And because I have told myself enough versions of this story that made me slightly less responsible for it, and none of those versions have done anything except make the telling easier. The facts are what they are. She looked at the back of his head, at the dark hair pulled back from that weathered profile, and she thought about what it cost a person to insist on their own full culpability, to refuse the mercy of partial accounting. The word she used, Audra said carefully. Please. Yes. That is why you opened the door. He did not answer immediately. The trail narrowed and he moved ahead of the horse for a section, and she followed, and when the trail widened again, he came back to her side. Her voice, he said, not the word, the quality of it, the way it sounded when all other options had been exhausted and this was the only one remaining. He paused. Your voice sounded the same way. Audra was quiet for a long time. The mountain moved around them. A raven crossed overhead, its shadow sliding across the trail. Somewhere in the tree line to the left, a branch dropped its load of accumulated water with a soft sound. Then God knew which door to send me to, she said. She said it quietly and without particular emphasis, not as a theological statement, but as a simple observation about the strangeness of how things arrange themselves. She felt him receive it, felt the way it moved through him without resistance, the way certain true things do. They did not speak for a while after that. When they did begin talking again, it was about practical things. The trail conditions ahead. The weather coming from the northwest that Cormac was watching with the attention he gave to everything that affected survival. The particular mud composition of the lower passes that would slow them down and how to account for it. But underneath the practical talk was the other conversation still present, still active, the one about Georgia and farmhouses, and the particular sound of a word said when there was nothing left to say after it. By early afternoon, the mountain trail had given way to something that more closely resembled a road rutted and churned from recent traffic but navigable, and the trees had thinned, and the sky was wider, and ahead of them still some distance but no longer abstract. The smoke of Layville was visible against the sky. Cormac looked at it and said nothing, but Audra watched him look at it. She watched the way his jaw set slightly and his shoulders took on a different quality, not more tense exactly, but more deliberate, more consciously held. She had seen that quality before in men who were managing something internal by the application of external discipline, and she recognized it because she had used it herself on many occasions and knew exactly how much effort the appearance of ease required. You do not have to go into town, she said. You can wait at the edge. I can find the boarding house on my own. No, he said. The word was flat and final and left no room for argument which she recognized as a different kind of decision from the one made out of comfort. This was a decision made in spite of discomfort, which was a harder thing entirely and deserved to be acknowledged and then left alone. She left it alone. Leadville announced itself before they reached it. The sound came first, a low, persistent rumble of activity that resolved as they drew closer into its component parts. Hammers, cartwheels on rough road, the bellowing voices of men doing physical work in conditions that required volume to communicate, the rhythmic mechanical breath of ore processing equipment, then the smell, coal smoke, and sulfur from the smelters, the less definable smell of a large number of people and animals in a relatively small space. Cormac's hand went to the knife at his belt, not drawing it, simply touching it the way a person touches something familiar when everything else is unfamiliar. Audra noticed this. She also noticed the way his eyes moved as they entered the first street of the town. Not the relaxed observational gaze he used on the mountain trail, but something faster and more systematic, covering angles and distances and movement in a pattern that was not that of a man sightseeing. It was the pattern of a man in territory he did not know and did not trust, assessing it the way he assessed the mountain when weather was turning and the stakes were high. She understood in that moment more completely than she had before what it had cost him to say yes to this. She did not remark on it. She dismounted from the horse and she took the lead rope and she began moving through the town with the businesslike purpose of a woman who had a specific destination and intended to reach it. Cormac fell in beside her and slightly behind, and they moved through the crowd together, and she was aware of him covering the space behind her and to the size in the way that a man who has spent years reading landscape for danger automatically covers space. She found the boarding house on the 3rd Street they tried. Mrs. Henderson's establishment was a 2-story wooden structure that was not elegant but was solid with curtains in the windows and a swept front step that suggested its proprietor maintained standards despite the general chaos of the town around it. Audra knocked, and the door was opened by a broad, gray-haired woman whose expression cycled from suspicion to recognition to something that was closer to relief than Audra was comfortable seeing. "Miss Voss," the woman said, "you came. I was not certain you would." "Mrs. Henderson," Audra said. "How is he?" The woman's hands twisted together in a way that people's hands do when they are carrying information they do not want to deliver. "He is upstairs, 3rd door. But I must tell you, Miss Voss, before you go up. The doctor was here again yesterday and he was not encouraging." "What does that mean specifically?" "The infection," Mrs. Henderson said. "It has spread. He has been in and out of fever for over a week. There was some talk of—" She stopped. "Perhaps you should just see him." Audra did not wait for her to finish. She took the stairs at a pace that was not quite running and pushed open the 3rd door on the right and stopped. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light of the room. It was the smell of serious illness, not the clean, functional smell of a body fighting fever, but the deeper, more complicated smell of infection that had moved past its early stages into something more systemic and concerning. She had smelled it before at her mother's bedside in the last weeks, and the recognition of it landed in her stomach like a stone dropped in still water. Fletcher was in the narrow bed along the wall. He looked smaller than she remembered him being. He had always been lean, but the weeks of illness had taken something further from him, some fundamental substance, and the result was a version of her brother that was technically present, but diminished. His face was pale with the particular pallor that sat under a fever flush, and his hair was damp against the pillow, and his right leg was splinted and wrapped in bandages that Audra did not need Cormac to tell her were not right. She was at his bedside before she had made a conscious decision to move. Fletcher, she said. She took his hand. It was hot and dry, the skin over the knuckles tight. Fletcher, I am here. It is Audra. His eyes opened. They were glassy and slow to focus, but they focused. Audra, his voice was rough and low. You should not be here. I wrote you not to come. I know you did, she said. The letter arrived after I had already left. You need to go back to Denver, he said. There is nothing you can do here. This is my mess and I will deal with it, but Fletcher, I mean it. Something in his voice sharpened, became briefly more himself. I made this choice. I came out here against your advice, and I ended up in this bed. That is not your problem to fix. You have done enough fixing of my problems. Audra held his hand and did not answer immediately because the answer required a moment to assemble correctly. Cormac had come into the room behind her. She had not heard him on the stairs, but she was aware of him now standing in the doorway, taking in the room and its contents with that systematic attention he applied to everything. He crossed to the bed without waiting to be asked. He examined the bandaging on Fletcher's leg with the careful, methodical attention of someone who knows what they are looking for and is finding it. He did not touch the leg, yet simply looked, following the edges of the wrapping, noting where the fabric was stained and what color the staining was, and how far it had spread from the wound site. Fletcher watched him. Who are you? Fletcher said. Cormac Hale, Cormac said, still looking at the leg. I have some knowledge of treating wounds. Your sister brought me. He looked up, then meeting Fletcher's eyes directly, something in his manner so plainly competent and unsentimental that it seemed to cut through the fever haze. You have an infection that has gone beyond the wound site. The bone was not set correctly, which has complicated everything. The doctor said he did the best he could, Fletcher said. The doctor may have done the best he was capable of, Cormac said. That does not mean it was sufficient. He was silent for a moment, still assessing. I need to look at the wound itself. This is going to be uncomfortable. Go ahead, Fletcher said. Then what happens if it keeps going the way it is going? Cormac looked at him steadily. You lose the leg, or you lose more than the leg. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then he turned his face toward the wall. I told you not to come, Audra, he said again. But the words had changed quality. They were not instruction now. They were something closer to apology. I know, she said. She kept hold of his hand. I did not want you to have to watch this. You do not get to decide that, she said. You are my brother. I do not get to not watch things that happen to you. That is not how this works. He did not answer, but his grip on her hand tightened fractionally. Cormac had moved away from the bedside and was standing near the window, speaking quietly to Audra alone. She released Fletcher's hand carefully and went to him. The infection has tracked up the leg, he said, keeping his voice low. The bone needs to be reset. The wound needs to be cleaned properly with the right materials, not what is available in this room. And he needs medicinal treatment that the physician here apparently has not been using. He looked at her. I can do these things, but not here. The conditions are not clean enough, and I do not have what I need. I need to bring him to the cabin. Can we move him? Moving him will cause him pain. Not moving him will cause him considerably more, and eventually permanently. He met her eyes. I will not tell you this will certainly save him, Audra. The infection is advanced, but I can give him a substantially better chance than he has lying in this room. She looked at her brother's face against the pillow. His eyes were closed again. Even in those few minutes of partial consciousness, he had exhausted whatever reserve he had for wakefulness. We go now, she said. Cormac nodded. I will need to build a travois, an hour no more. She went back to Fletcher's wade while Cormac went to speak to Mrs. Henderson about materials. She sat with her brother in the close, difficult air of that room, and she held his hand, and she talked to him quietly, not about anything consequential, just talking, her voice a steady presence in the room, while Cormac moved efficiently through the building below and then outside. At one point, Fletcher opened his eyes again and looked at her. "The man," he said, "he knows what he is doing." "Yes," she said, "I believe he does." "You trust him." It was not a question exactly, but it required an answer. "I do," she said. Fletcher looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You came all this way," he said quietly, mostly to himself, "through a storm, with a fever from the look of you." He turned his head to look at her. "I am sorry, Audra, for all of it, for leaving, for not coming back when you asked, for making you come here. You can spend the rest of your life apologizing if you want," she said. "But first you have to have a rest of your life. So right now, what I need from you is for you to cooperate with what is about to happen, which is going to be unpleasant, and to not give up." Something moved in his face. "I have been thinking about giving up," he said. "I know," she said. "I can see it. Stop thinking about it. It would be simpler." "For you," she said without heat, simply as a fact. "Not for me, so do not." He almost smiled. The shape of it was there in his face, even if the full expression was too much effort. Cormac returned in 50 minutes with a travois constructed from poles and canvas he had obtained from a supply merchant 2 streets over. He and Audra, with Mrs. Henderson providing extra blankets and watching with the particular helpless concern of a woman who had done all she knew how to do and understood it was not enough, transferred Fletcher from the bed to the travois. Fletcher cried out when they moved his leg despite their care, a sound that was brief and involuntary and cost him visible effort to suppress, and Audra kept her face still and her hands steady because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not available. Cormac secured Fletcher to the travois with practiced efficiency, the knots firm but not constrictive, the padding distributed to minimize the impact of uneven terrain. "This will take most of the night," Cormac said to Audra quietly. "The trail is not easy in the dark." "I know," she said. "He will be in pain through most of it." "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment. "Stay close to him," he said. "Talk to him when he is conscious. It helps." "It helps," she repeated. "You know this from experience." "From being the one who needed someone to talk to him," he said. It was the most personal thing he had said to her, and he said it without apparent calculation, as a simple truth offered because it was relevant. Then he picked up the travois poles and began moving, and Audra took her position beside Fletcher, and they left Leadville as the sun went behind the mountains. The journey that followed was among the hardest things Audra Voss had ever done, and she had done hard things. It was not that any single moment of it was beyond endurance. It was the accumulation of it, the relentlessness of it, the way the mountain trail asked the same things of her body hour after hour, without acknowledgement that those things were becoming progressively more expensive. Her legs ached. Her lungs ached with the altitude and the cold. The lantern she carried cast a small, determined circle of light that showed her the immediate ground underfoot and nothing beyond it, so that the darkness on all sides felt absolute in a way that daylight travel never prepared a person for. Fletcher drifted in and out of consciousness beside her. When he was conscious, she talked to him. She told him about the cabin on the mountain, describing it in the detail that she had had time to observe over 2 days of convalescence. She told him about the herbs hanging from the rafters and the neatly stacked firewood and the lamp in the window that Cormac kept burning when storms came through. She told him about the elk she had seen that morning on the trail, a small herd moving through a meadow below them with a beautiful, complete indifference to the humans watching from above. When he was not conscious, she talked to him anyway because Cormac had said it helped, and she had decided to believe him. Cormac moved ahead of them, both pulling the travois with the steady, powerful economy of a man who had spent 8 years building the kind of physical capability that did not announce itself, but simply functioned when required. He did not slow. He did not complain. He navigated the dark trail with the confidence of someone who knew it well enough to read it by feel and by the sound of the wind through the trees and by whatever other signals 8 years of this particular landscape had taught his body to receive. They stopped once, perhaps two-thirds of the way through the journey. Cormac set the travois down with care and stretched his back and shoulders in a brief, unself-conscious movement. Audra gave Fletcher water and the small amount of willow bark tea that Cormac had prepared before they left Leadville. Fletcher drank it without opening his eyes, some animal part of him responding to the presence of liquid, even when the conscious part was elsewhere. Audra straightened and found Cormac standing a few feet away, looking up at the sky. The stars were out. Extraordinary numbers of them, the way they appeared at altitude, after a storm had scrubbed the air clean, spread across the darkness in profusion that seemed excessive, almost argumentative, as if the sky were making a point about scale. "How are you?" he asked. He was looking at the sky, not at her. "Tired," she said, "but fine. How are you?" He seemed slightly surprised by the question, as if the direction of concern in his usual experience did not typically run that way. "Fine," he said. They stood for a moment in the immense quiet of the mountain night. "Cormac," she said. "Yes." "What you said earlier, about being the one who needed someone to talk to him. When was that?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Second winter," he said. "I got a fever. Bad one. I was alone, obviously. I managed it the practical side of it. But there were a few nights where the fever was high enough that I was not entirely certain which side of consciousness I was on." He paused. "I talked to myself. It sounds foolish." "It sounds human," she said. He looked at the stars. "I told myself about Missouri," he said, "about the farm where I grew up, the particular smell of the fields in early summer before the heat arrived. My mother's kitchen. Small things." He was quiet. "I suppose I was reminding myself that I had existed before this mountain, that there was a continuous person who had lived in those places and also lived here, and that the continuity meant something." Audra looked at his profile against the stars. Did it work? "I am still here," he said simply. They were quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We should keep moving." "Yes," he said. He lifted the travois poles again, and they moved back into the dark. It was in the deepest part of the night, somewhere past 3 in the morning by Audra's estimate, on a steep section of trail where the footing was uncertain and the trees pressed close on both sides, and the lantern light seemed thinner than it had an hour before that Cormac stopped. He set the travois down, he straightened, and then without any transition that Audra could identify, he was not standing anymore. He was on his knees in the trail, his hands against his thighs, his head slightly bowed. She was beside him in an instant. "Cormac." She put her hand on his shoulder. The muscle under her hand was rigid as stone. "What is it? Are you hurt?" "No," he said. His voice was controlled but different, something underneath it that she could hear but not quite name. "Then what?" He was silent for a long moment. Around them, the mountain was utterly still, the kind of stillness that exists only in the deep middle hours of the night, when even the wind has stopped and everything is simply waiting. "I do not know," he said, "if I am the right person to be doing this." She did not speak immediately. She stayed beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and she let the sentence exist in the air between them, without rushing to fill the space around it. I have done more harm than good in my life, he said. On the whole, when I added up, he was looking at the ground in front of him. I am not certain I have the standing to be the one who saves someone. It feels like a role I have not earned. This was what had been underneath the controlled exterior for the entire journey, she understood. Not the physical effort of pulling the travois, which he was more than equal to. The other thing, the question of whether a man who had stood in a Georgia yard and watched a farmhouse burn had the right to be out here in the dark fighting for someone's life. She thought about what to say. She rejected several things. Then she said, "You do not have to have earned it. Worthiness is not how any of this works. You just have to keep moving." He looked up at her. "That is all," she said. "Not more than that. Just keep moving." Something in his face shifted. Not a dramatic change, not a breaking open of anything. A small incremental change, like ice beginning to change its mind about remaining ice. He rose to his feet. He picked up the travois poles. He kept moving. They reached the cabin as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the darkness thinning to a gray that was not yet dawn but was the announcement of it. The advance noticed that the night was willing to negotiate. Audra's legs were past pain and into a kind of numb persistence that she recognized as the body's last form of cooperation before it stopped cooperating entirely. Cormac pulled the travois directly to the door. He lifted Fletcher from it with careful strength, carrying him inside and laying him on the bed where Audra had spent her own fever nights. Fletcher was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and rapid, his face gray in the gray pre-dawn light. Cormac went to work immediately. He built the fire with quick, efficient movements and set water to heat and began moving along the shelves, gathering items with the focused purpose of a man who has a plan and is executing it. He spoke to Audra without looking at her, directing her to cut away the bandaging on Fletcher's leg, providing the knife, telling her clearly what she was doing and why. She did it. What she saw when the bandaging came away made her look away briefly and then look back, because looking away was a luxury she could not afford. The wound was serious, the infection was visible in the tissue, the discoloration and the swelling and the unhealthy fluid, and she could see where the bone had been set improperly and what that had meant for everything around it. Cormac examined it with clinical detachment and told her what he was going to do and why, step by step, with the precision of someone who had thought it through completely and was not uncertain. "Will it be enough?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "I do not know," he said. "I will do everything I know how to do. That has to be enough for now." It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. She held Fletcher's hand through what came next, which was difficult and necessary, and done with as much care as the circumstances allowed. Fletcher bore it without losing consciousness, which Cormac said afterward was a reasonable sign. His body still had enough presence to respond to pain, which meant it still had resources to fight with. When it was done, Cormac stepped back and looked at his work with the evaluating eye of someone who is checking their own arithmetic. "Now we wait," he said. Audra looked at Fletcher's face against the pillow. His eyes were closed. His breathing was more even than it had been, which might mean something or might mean nothing. It was too soon to know. She looked at Cormac. He was standing at the foot of the bed with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the assessing look, not the careful, controlled distance he maintained when he was managing himself in relation to the external world. Something underneath all of that briefly visible, something that looked like hope. "He has a chance," Cormac said, "a real one." Audra pressed her hands over her face and the tears came, and she did not fight them, because fighting them at this particular moment would have been a waste of energy she no longer had to waste. She felt Cormac's hand on her shoulder. It was the same weight and warmth it had carried on the mountain trail at 3 in the morning, steady and present and asking nothing. She put her hand over his and held it there for a moment, and he did not move away. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the mountains, the first light touching the peaks and moving slowly down toward the valley below. The cabin was warm. The fire was burning. The herbs hanging from the rafters moved slightly in the heated air and released their faint, complicated smell. Fletcher Voss was breathing. That was what mattered now. That was everything. The first sign that Fletcher Voss intended to survive was that he became difficult. Not immediately. The first 2 days after they brought him down from Leadville, he was too ill for anything as purposeful as difficulty. He drifted in the fever the way a man drifts in deep water, surfacing occasionally, looking around with glassy, unfocused eyes, accepting water and medicine, when Audra or Cormac offered it, and then sinking again. His breathing remained shallow and his color remained poor, and the wound on his leg, which Cormac checked and redressed with quiet, methodical attention twice each day, was still angry and complicated, and not yet making up its mind about which direction it intended to go. Cormac said little during these 2 days beyond what was medically necessary. He worked with concentrated precision, preparing poultices from the dried herbs on his shelves, combining tinctures. According to formulations he had worked out over years of solitary practice and occasional consultation with an older woman in Leadville who had been delivering babies and treating wounds since before the war. He slept in short intervals in the chair beside the bed or at the workbench with his arms folded, waking at any change in Fletcher's breathing with the immediate alertness of someone whose sleep had never been particularly deep. Audra slept in longer intervals because Cormac insisted on it with the quiet, irrefutable logic that she had come to recognize as his most effective form of persuasion. She had been sick herself less than a week ago. Her body was still in the process of recovering. If she pushed past its limits now, she would become a second patient rather than a caregiver, and that would serve no one, least of all Fletcher. She accepted this and slept, and when she woke, she took her turn beside the bed, and Cormac took his turn in the chair with his arms on his knees and his eyes on the fire. They had fallen into a rhythm without discussing it, the way people who are managing something serious together sometimes do, the necessary coordination happening at a level below conscious decision. She noticed things about him in those days that she had not had the attention to notice before. She noticed that he always made sure she had eaten before he ate himself, not through any declaration of this as a policy, but simply as a consistent fact of how meals happened. She noticed that when he moved around the cabin in the night, he did so with a silence that was not natural to a man of his size, but had clearly been learned, the careful footfall of someone who had decided that his own needs for movement should not disturb another person's rest. She noticed that he talked to Fletcher when Fletcher was unconscious, not at length, not with any apparent self-consciousness, just brief and steady statements delivered in that low, even voice. Your color is better this morning. The infection is responding. You are going to be all right. As if saying it aloud made it more likely to be true. As if the body, given clear enough instruction, would comply. On the morning of the third day, Fletcher opened his eyes and stayed open. Not the glassy, unfocused opening of the fever days, but genuinely open, present, taking in his surroundings with the deliberate attention of a man orienting himself after a long absence. He lay still for a moment, conducting what appeared to be a systematic inventory of where he was and what state he was in. Then he turned his head and found Audra in the chair beside the bed. You look terrible, he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but it was his voice, recognizable in particular, the voice she had known for 20 years. "You look worse," she said. "How do you feel?" "Like the mountain fell on me." He blinked slowly, which is not entirely inaccurate. He looked at the ceiling of the cabin, at the dried herbs and the rough-hewn beams. "Where am I?" "Cormac's cabin," she said. "In the mountains above Leadville. He has been treating your leg." Fletcher absorbed this. He moved his head carefully to take in the rest of the room. Cormac was at the workbench in the corner, his back to the bed, apparently giving Fletcher the space to reorient without an audience. "He is large," Fletcher said at a volume that Cormac certainly heard. "He is," Audra agreed. "And he knows what he is doing with the leg. More than the doctor in Leadville did," she said. "Yes." Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "It was bad," he said, not a question. "It was serious," she asserted. "It is still serious, but it is better than it was." He turned his face back to the ceiling and was quiet for a while. Audra let him be quiet. She had learned over 20 years of knowing this particular person that he needed a certain amount of silence to process things, that rushing him produced a kind of defensive stubbornness that was counterproductive, and that patience with him was almost always more efficient than urgency. "I meant what I said in Leadville," he said finally, "that you should not have come. I know you meant it. I wrote to tell you not to come. I know that too. The letter was late." He turned his head to look at her. There was something in his face that was more complicated than illness, something that had been there before the fever and the mind collapse and the failed bone setting, something that she recognized because she had been watching it accumulate in him for years. "I did not want you to come," he said slowly, "because I did not want you to see what I had done to myself, what I had made of the chances you gave me." He stopped. "You worked for 3 years to save money so I could have a life. I took that money and came out here and got myself half killed in a hole in the ground." He looked at the ceiling again. "That is not the kind of thing you want your sister to witness." "Fletcher," she said. "I am not finished," he said with a flash of the stubbornness she knew well. "I need to say this." He gathered himself. "After Mother died, you held everything together. You did not stop. You did not fall apart. You just worked and planned and made sure there was food and rent and a future to be working toward. And I left. I told myself it was about opportunity and adventure and making something of myself, but the truth is that I left because being around you made me feel guilty for not being as strong as you were, and it was easier to be somewhere else than to feel that." The room was very quiet. "I am sorry, Audra. I am sorry for all of it." She reached out and took his hand. "You are an idiot," she said. Her voice was steady and she meant the words with complete affection. "A spectacular, irreplaceable idiot, and I would have followed you into that mine with a fever and no horse and a borrowed pair of men's trousers if that was what it took to get you out. There is nothing to forgive, Fletcher. There is only you getting well, and then we will figure out the rest." He looked at her. Something in his face that had been clenched for a long time loosened slightly. "Men's trousers," he said. "Canvas," she confirmed. "2 sizes too large." He almost laughed. The shape of it moved through him and then stopped because laughing hurt, and he settled for a slight easing of his expression that was close enough. Cormac brought broth shortly after and helped Fletcher drink it with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he brought to all medical tasks, and Fletcher submitted to this with better grace than Audra had expected. The days that followed had a different quality from the crisis days. The cabin, which had been holding its breath through Fletcher's worst hours, seemed to exhale. The rhythms of it changed. Fletcher was awake for longer periods each day, and when he was awake, he was present, and engaged in a way that required the rest of them to be present and engaged in return. Because Fletcher Voss was not a man who occupied space quietly. He asked questions. He had opinions. He observed everything around him with the bright, restless attention of someone who had been bored and frightened in equal measure for weeks and was now simply bored, which was a significant improvement. He observed Audra and Cormac with particular attention. Audra was aware of this. She was aware of it the way you are aware of something in your peripheral vision that you have not yet decided to look at directly. Fletcher watched the way Cormac moved around her, the slight automatic adjustments he made to his position when she was working near the fire or carrying something heavy, the way his eyes tracked to her whenever she moved. He watched the way Audra spoke to Cormac, the quality of directness that she used with very few people and never with people she did not fundamentally trust. He said nothing about this for 4 days. On the 4th day, when Cormac had gone out to check on the horse and gather firewood, Fletcher turned to Audra with the expression of a person who has been patiently waiting to say something and has now decided the waiting is finished. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Tell me about him," Fletcher said. "You have been watching him for 4 days," she said. "You have formed your own opinions." "I have," he agreed. "I would like to compare them to yours." She looked at her brother. He was propped against the pillows. The color returned to his face in something closer to its normal proportion. His legs still splinted and elevated, but the swelling measurably reduced from its worst. He looked, she thought, more like himself than he had since before she arrived at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. "He is a good man," she said. "He is careful and competent and honest in a way that most people are not. And I trust him." Fletcher held her eyes. "Audra, I know you. I have known you for 20 years. You trust very few people, and the ones you trust completely, and it has been a long time since you have trusted anyone that way." He paused. "He is not just someone you trust practically, is he?" She did not answer immediately. Outside, she could hear Cormac's footsteps on the porch, the deliberate and quiet footfall she had come to recognize as distinctly his, the sound of someone who had learned to move through the world without making more noise in it than strictly necessary. "No," she said, "he is not." Fletcher nodded slowly. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "He carries something dark," he said. "I can see it in him. Not something he does, something he has done, or something that was done around him. The war, I imagine." He was quiet. "I am not saying this to caution you away from him. I am saying it because you have spent your whole life carrying other people's weight, Audra. Our father's absence, mother's illness, my foolishness. And I need to ask you directly whether this is another weight you are picking up because you feel you should, or whether it is something different." The door opened and Cormac came in with an armload of wood. He crossed to the wood stack beside the hearth and deposited it with practiced care, then turned. He read the room in the way he read everything, quickly and accurately. "I can go back outside," he said without any particular self-consciousness about it. "No need," Fletcher said. "I have finished what I was saying." Audra looked at her brother for a moment. "It is different," she said. And that was all she said, but Fletcher received it and sat with it, and after a moment gave the small, deliberate nod of a person who has asked a genuine question and received a genuine answer. That evening, when Fletcher had fallen asleep and the cabin was quiet with the specific quality of quiet that only exists when the crisis is genuinely past, and what remains is simply the ordinary work of recovery, Audra and Cormac sat beside the fire. She had been thinking about what she wanted to say for several days. She had been turning it over in the way she turned over difficult sewing problems, looking at it from different angles, finding the places where the structure was sound and the places where it needed reinforcement. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask, he said. Do you want a real life? He looked at her. Not survival, she said. You are extraordinarily capable of survival. I think you could live on this mountain for another 40 years and maintain yourself in perfect functional condition and be no closer to a real life than you are right now. She kept her voice even, not unkind, simply direct. I am asking whether you want more than that, whether underneath the 8 years of deliberate solitude and the penance and the careful management of your own existence, there is a man who wants to actually live. Cormac was quiet for a long time. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, the mountain was doing what it always did, which was everything and nothing simultaneously. I stood on a cliff, he said. She waited. After the war, before I came here, I stood on a cliff above the river in Missouri, and I looked down for a long time. He said it the same way he said everything plainly and without the softening of misdirection. I did not jump, not because I had decided to live exactly. It was more that I could not determine whether I had the right to choose the form of my own ending when I had not given sufficient consideration to the endings I had contributed to in others. He paused. That is a cold reason to stay alive, but it was the one I had. And you came to the mountain. I came to the mountain, he said, and I built something. Not a life exactly, a functional structure for containing myself, a way of existing that did not require me to inflict myself on anyone else and did not require anyone else to know what I was carrying. Punishment, she said. He looked at the fire. Yes. Cormac. She waited until he looked at her. The woman in Georgia. You have been paying for her for 14 years. You have been paying in solitude and self-denial and the deliberate erasure of any possibility of happiness. And I want to ask you something about that payment. She held his gaze. Has it helped her? Has it helped her children? Has anything that you have done to yourself in the past 14 years made one single moment of what happened to that family any different? He did not answer. Punishment does not build anything, she said. It does not repair what was broken. It does not restore what was lost. It is a story we tell ourselves about justice when we cannot access actual justice. And the problem with the story is that it consumes the person telling it without producing anything of value. She leaned forward slightly. But you built this cabin. With your hands out of this mountain, you made something that has been here through 8 winters and has sheltered travelers and saved lives. You can build more, Cormac. The question is whether you are willing to stop spending everything you have on a debt that cannot be paid that way. He was very still. There is another question underneath that one, she said more quietly, and I am going to ask it because I have learned in the past week that you respond better to directness than to anything else. She paused. Do you want this? Not the idea of it, not the abstract proposition of human connection. Do you want specifically this, what is in this room right now? What has been growing between us since the night I knocked on your door? The fire cracked. Fletcher breathed steadily in the bed on the other side of the room. Cormac looked at her for a long time. I want it more than I know how to say, he said, and I am afraid of it in equal measure, because wanting something means the possibility of losing it, and I have built my entire existence around eliminating that possibility. He stopped. I do not know how to want things safely. No one does, she said. That is not how wanting works. He absorbed this. I have not been around people in 8 years, he said. I am rough and unsocialized, and I have nightmares that wake me at 3 in the morning, and I have done things that I will carry for the rest of my life regardless of whether I deserve to put them down. He looked at her steadily. You know all of this. I know all of this, she confirmed, and you are still here. I am still here. Something shifted in his face. The same small incremental shift she had seen on the mountain trail. When he rose from his knees and picked up the travois poles, the movement of a man making a decision that costs him something real. Then I want it, he said, all of it, whatever it requires. She reached across and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, and they sat like that beside the fire while the mountain held the night around the cabin, and Fletcher slept, and the herbs moved in the warm air above them. They did not speak for a long time, and the silence was not empty. It was full of everything that had been said, and everything that did not need to be said, and it was the most comfortable silence Audra had inhabited in longer than she could clearly remember. She understood home, not in the geographical sense, not yet, but home in the sense that mattered first and most, the sense of being in the right place with the right person at the right moment, of all the various pieces of herself that she had been holding separately and carefully for years, existing simultaneously in the same space without effort or management. She had not known she was looking for this. She had known she was looking for Fletcher and for safety and for enough money to stop being afraid about rent and food and the practical mechanics of surviving. She had not known that underneath all of those reasonable and concrete desires was this other one, wordless and patient, waiting to be found. The weeks of Fletcher's recovery settled into a shape that had both structure and ease. Cormac continued the twice-daily wound assessment and dressing changes, tracking the infection's retreat with the careful attention of someone who knew that improvement was not linear and that apparent progress could reverse without warning. He adjusted the herbal preparations as needed, adding and removing components based on what he observed, consulting occasionally the small leather journal he kept, in which he had recorded over 8 years. Everything he had learned about treating illness and injury in a place where no other help was available. Fletcher proved to be a better patient than his personality had led Audra to anticipate. He complained consistently and with considerable creativity about the boredom, the pain, and the limitations of his diet, but he complied with everything Cormac required of him without the sullen resentment that compliance under duress usually carries. He complied because he understood what Cormac was doing and why, because Cormac had explained it plainly, and Fletcher was underneath the impulsiveness an intelligent man who recognized competence when he encountered it. They developed, Fletcher and Cormac, an unlikely rapport. It began with practical conversation. Fletcher asking questions about the cabin's construction, about the trapping, about the mechanics of living at altitude through a Colorado winter. Cormac answering with the same precision he applied to everything, offering information without performance or condescension. Then one afternoon, Audra came in from gathering wood to find them deep in a conversation about the war, Fletcher asking and Cormac answering with more directness than he had used even with Audra, the account of a man speaking to another man who had grown up in the same era and understood the context without needing it explained. Fletcher had been too young to fight, but he had grown up in the aftermath, had watched it reshape. His father had understood from childhood that the war was not a historical event, but a living presence that continued making decisions in the people who had survived it. They talked for over an hour. Audra listened from the doorway for a while and then went back outside because some conversations need space and because hearing Cormac speak about those years with someone who asked different questions than she had asked was giving her new angles on a person she was always in the process of understanding. On the evening of the 8th day of Fletcher's recovery, Cormac examined the wound and straightened and said simply that the infection had cleared. Not that it was improving, that it had cleared. He said it with the same tone he might have used to report that the weather was expected to hold a simple factual statement delivered without ceremony, and then he went to wash his hands and put the kettle on. Audra sat with the information for a moment. Then she looked at her brother. Fletcher was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has received good news and is quietly, privately, deeply relieved by it in a way he does not intend to display. Told you, she said. You told me nothing of the sort, he said. You told me to cooperate and stop being dramatic, which is what I always tell you when I mean everything is going to be fine. He turned his head to look at her, and for a moment he was 12 years old again. Her 12-year-old brother looking at her from a scraped knee or a broken window, with the expression of someone who knows they have been rescued but is not yet ready to say so. Thank you, Audra, he said, for coming, for all of it. Always, she said. 2 days later, Cormac helped Fletcher stand, for the first time supporting him carefully while Fletcher tested the leg with gradually increasing weight, his face set in the controlled expression of a person managing significant pain with the knowledge that the management is necessary. The leg held. Not comfortably, not without pain, but it held, which meant the bone was setting properly and the foundation of recovery was sound. Fletcher took 3 steps with Cormac's support and then sat back down on the bed and looked at the leg with an expression of moderate betrayal. It will improve, Cormac said. How quickly? Honestly, slowly. This is a serious injury that was seriously mismanaged before we had the chance to address it properly. You will likely have a limp for some time, possibly permanently. Fletcher absorbed this. Possibly, Audra said. That word is doing a great deal of work. It is, Cormac agreed with the slight, dry quality that she had come to recognize as his version of humor. Possibly means we will know more in a month than we do now. Fletcher looked at his leg for another moment. Then he looked up. I am not going back to mining, he said. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. It was the statement of a man completing an internal conversation that had apparently been ongoing for some time. Good, Audra said. I have been thinking about Denver. There is a market for dry goods in the neighborhoods north of the city center. The existing establishments are not well organized. I have been making notes. He glanced at her somewhat defensively. In my head, mental notes. Of course you have, she said with the particular affection that is reserved for the irreducible nature of people you love. I would need some capital to start, he said. I know you have savings. We will discuss it, she said, when you can walk without someone holding you up. Fletcher looked at Cormac. She has always been like this, he said. I know, Cormac said. Fletcher looked between the two of them for a moment. Yes, he said to no one in particular. I suppose you do. It was on a clear, cold morning, 10 days after they had brought Fletcher down from Leadville, that Cormac told her he wanted to marry her. He did not make a production of it. They were on the porch in the early morning, the air sharp and clean and thin in the way of high-altitude mornings when the sky has not yet decided to commit to the day. She was drinking coffee from a tin cup and watching the mountains to the east catch the first light, and he came out and stood beside her and was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet before he said something that mattered. I want to marry you, he said, if you are willing. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the mountains, not at her, which she had come to understand was not evasion, but was the way he organized himself when what he was saying was important. I am aware that this is fast, he said, by the standards of how these things are supposed to work. I am aware that 2 weeks is not the length of time that people are supposed to need to arrive at a conclusion like this. He paused. but I find that I have no interest in following the timeline of what is supposed to happen. I know what I know, and I know that you are the first person I have met in 14 years who I want to be near, and the first person who has made me feel that being near is something other than a hazard. He was quiet for a moment. I want to marry you, and I want to build something here that is bigger than what one person can build alone, and I want to do that with you if you will have me. Audra looked at the mountains. The light was doing something extraordinary to the peaks, the way it did at this hour, turning the snow on the highest elevations, a color that was between gold and pink and had no proper name in any language she knew. The trees in the valley below were the deep green of late fall, the ones that had not gone bare, and between them the aspens had gone entirely yellow, whole hillsides of yellow that caught the light and threw it back. She had grown up in St. Louis. She had grown up with streets and neighbors and the particular rhythm of city life, the constant proximity of other people, the noise and the commerce and the sociability of it. She had not been unhappy there exactly, but she understood, now standing on this porch with this man beside her and the mountains doing improbable things with the morning light, that what she had been in St. Louis was functional, that she had been managing her life with considerable competence while being at some fundamental level elsewhere, waiting for something she had not known she was waiting for. Yes, she said. He turned to look at her then. She looked back. Yes, she said again. That is my answer. Something in his face, which was not a face that had a great deal of practice with uncomplicated joy, attempted joy, and very nearly succeeded. It was not the broad, easy expression of a man for whom happiness came readily. It was the careful, almost tentative expression of a man who was not certain that happiness was permitted to him and was finding that it was here anyway, present and real, and that he was going to have to simply accept it. She reached up and put her hand against his bearded jaw. He covered her hand with his. They stood like that in the thick mountain morning with the light moving down the peaks toward them, and it was enough. It was entirely enough. It was more than she had known to ask for. Fletcher was informed of the engagement later that morning. His response was a period of silence that lasted approximately 5 seconds and was followed by a statement delivered with the straight-faced gravity of a man raising a serious concern. He is enormous, Fletcher said. You understand that any children you have will also be enormous. Fletcher, Audra said, I am simply noting the practical implications. He is right here, she said. I am aware of that, Fletcher said, and looked at Cormac with an expression that was trying to be stern and failing comprehensively. You intend to take care of her. For the rest of my life, Cormac said. He said it without elaboration or performance, simply as a fact of the same order as any other fact. Fletcher held his gaze for a moment. Whatever he found there satisfied whatever he was looking for. Good, he said. She has taken care of everyone else for long enough. They set the date for when Fletcher could make the journey to Leadville, which Cormac estimated at 2 weeks, possibly 3. Fletcher, motivated by a stubbornness that appeared to extend to the cellular level, achieved it in 12 days. In those 12 days, Audra sewed. She had purchased fabric in Leadville before they left, a length of deep blue wool that was practical enough for mountain life and fine enough for the occasion she had in mind. She worked at the small table near the window in the mornings when the light was best. Her mother's sewing box open beside her, the familiar weight and smell of the tools that had moved through her family's hands for 3 generations present and grounding. Cormac watched her work in the evenings sometimes. He did not comment on it, but she was aware of his attention, the way he glanced at the growing garment with an expression that contained something she could not immediately name and then identified as wonder. The wonder of a man watching someone do something difficult with what appeared to be ease, which he understood from his own experience with the mountain was not ease at all, but only the appearance of it produced by years of practice, rendering the difficult invisible. She sewed him a shirt as well. Dark flannel well fitted, replacing the one that had been beyond repair since the journey back from Leadville. She presented it to him without ceremony, folding it and setting it on the workbench beside him one morning, and he picked it up and looked at it for a long moment and then looked at her and said thank you in a way that required the two words to work considerably harder than two words usually work. The morning they were to leave for Leadville, Audra woke before dawn and found the cabin empty. Not just quiet, empty. The fire had been banked, but not tended, which meant Cormac had been gone for some time. His coat was missing from the hook by the door. She dressed quickly and went out into the frost-bright morning. She could see his tracks in the frozen ground moving with purpose toward the ridge above the tree line. She followed them without hesitation. She found him standing at the edge of the ridge, at the place where the ground gave way to the long drop toward the valley below. He was not looking down. He was looking east where the sky was beginning to lighten, in the particular way it did before a mountain sunrise, the darkness retreating in slow, layered increments that revealed the world gradually rather than all at once. She came to stand beside him and did not speak. He did not startle at her presence, which told her he had heard her coming, which told her he had not been trying to be alone. He had simply needed the place. They stood together for a while in the enormous quiet of the ridge, the valley still in shadow far below the creek, somewhere among those dark trees catching what little light reached it and throwing back a faint silver thread. I used to come here, he said finally, in the first years, to remind myself of certain things. What things, she asked, that I deserved to be alone, that solitude was not a condition that had happened to me, but a punishment I had chosen and was required to maintain. He was looking at the lightening sky, his voice steady and unhurried. I have not been up here in several years. I came this morning because I needed to say goodbye to the man who came here for that reason. He paused. Some goodbyes require the place as well as the intention. Audra looked at the valley below. Is he gone? She asked. That man Cormac considered this with the seriousness he gave to everything that deserved it. Not entirely, he said. I do not think he goes entirely. Some part of him will always be in Georgia, standing in that yard, watching the smoke rise. I have made my peace with that. He is not going to be reasoned away or loved away or forgiven away. He is simply there. He turned to look at her. The pre-dawn light was the particular soft gray that made everything look like it was still deciding what it was going to be. But he is no longer the one making decisions, Cormac said. You are. She held out her hand. He took it. They stood together on the ridge for a moment longer, looking at the valley below and the sky above, and the mountains stretching away in every direction, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they do not need you to find them so. Then they walked down together toward the smoke rising from the chimney and the sound of Fletcher's voice already carrying from inside the cabin toward the life that was waiting to begin. She dressed in the blue wool dress in the gray pre-dawn light. She braided her hair and pinned it and then went to the edge of the clearing where the frost had kept the last of the season's small wildflowers alive in a sheltered spot she had noticed 2 days ago, and she picked a handful purple and white and the pale yellow of late autumn and wound them into her braid. When they came back inside, Cormac was standing by the fire already dressed in the dark flannel shirt she had made him, and when he saw her he stopped entirely still, in the way he sometimes went, still the way of a man registering something significant. You made that, he said, meaning the dress. I did, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. You are beautiful, Audra Voss, he said. He said it the way he said things that mattered without qualification or elaboration, a simple statement of observed fact. She felt the words land exactly where they were aimed. Not for much longer, she said. Voss, I mean. Something in his face did what it had been doing more frequently over the past 2 weeks, the careful, almost surprised movement toward joy. They woke Fletcher. The journey to Leadville took the better part of the day. Fletcher on the horse with his splinted leg carefully positioned, Audra and Cormax walking on either side. Fletcher complained about the pace, which was slower than he preferred, and about the cold, which was genuine, and about the fact that he had not had a proper meal in weeks, which was an exaggeration that everyone allowed him, because some exaggerations serve a purpose. Between the complaints, there were long sections of companionable silence, the three of them moving through the mountain landscape in the thin October light. Audra thought that this too was a thing worth noticing. The ease of it. The way these two people who had not known each other 3 weeks ago moved through the same space without friction, as if they had been calibrated to coexist. They found a minister in Leadville on the 2nd Street. They tried a circuit preacher named Alderton who was in town for the week and who agreed to perform the ceremony with the practical good nature of a man who had presided over weddings in enough improvised settings to have stopped requiring that they meet any particular standard of formality. The ceremony was held in the small room at the back of the church that served as the minister's temporary office, with Fletcher leaning on the crutch Cormac had carved for him and serving as the only witness, and 2 candles on the minister's desk, providing the lighting and the wind off the mountains audible through the thin walls. Cormac held both her hands. His hands were larger than hers by a considerable margin, scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who had built things and broken things and spent 8 years learning a mountain. She felt the weight and warmth of them and thought about everything those hands had done and everything they were going to do and the extraordinary circuitous route by which they had ended up holding hers. I promise to love you honestly, Cormac said when the minister reached the vows. His voice was low and steady, the voice she had heard say difficult things plainly and tender things carefully and true things always. Not perfectly. I do not have the capacity for perfect, but honestly, completely, and without reservation. I promise to stand with you in whatever comes, not in front of you and not behind you, but beside you. I promise to build something with you that is bigger and better than anything I could build alone. He paused and his grip on her hands tightened very slightly. I promise to keep the lamp burning in the window, whatever that requires and for as long as I am able. She had not expected that last part. She had not expected it, and it undid her just slightly, just enough that she had to take a breath before she could answer. I promise to love you for exactly what you are, she said. Not what you were, and not what you fear you might be, but what you actually are, which is a man of extraordinary kindness and considerable courage, who opened a door in a storm and saved my life, and then let me save his. She held his gaze. I promise to stay, not because staying is easy, because you are worth staying for. The minister said the words that ministers say. Cormac kissed her in the careful way of a man who is aware that things of real value require real care, and she kissed him back, and Fletcher made a sound in the background that was somewhere between a laugh and something more complicated than a laugh, and it was enough. It was exactly and precisely enough. They had dinner at the only restaurant in Leadville that justified the name, a modest establishment with checked tablecloths, and a cook who knew what to do with venison in a way that most people in this town did not. Fletcher ordered enough food for what appeared to be 3 additional people, and they sat in the warmth of the small dining room while the cold outside deepened toward evening, and Fletcher told stories about growing up in St. Louis with a dramatic license that improved each event considerably over the version Audra remembered. Cormac was quieter than the other two, which was consistent with his character. But there was a quality to his quiet that was different from the quality she had first encountered. This was not the quiet of a man managing his own proximity to people. This was the quiet of a man who was simply present, who was in the room in the moment, in the evening, and was not spending any portion of himself on wishing he were elsewhere. She caught his eye across the table at one point during a particularly elaborate section of Fletcher's storytelling, and he looked at her with an expression that required no translation. They returned to the cabin the next morning, and the cabin, which had been a shelter, and then a place of crisis, and then a place of recovery, became on that morning something else entirely. It became home. Not because anything physical had changed, because the people in it had been changed by what they had survived together, and a place that holds changed people is different from the place it was before. The years that followed were built from ordinary things. Fletcher went to Denver in the spring. He established the dry goods business he had outlined from his sickbed in the cabin, and it succeeded not dramatically but steadily, the way things that are well planned and carefully managed tend to succeed. He came back to the mountain every autumn, the journey becoming shorter in his estimation each year as the road improved and as the destination became more deeply familiar. He walked with a slight limp that he referred to when anyone commented on it as his souvenir from the Colorado Silver Rush, and he said it with the rueful humor of a man who has come to terms with what his choices cost him. In the second year of their marriage, Audra had a son. She had known it was coming for several months before she told Cormac, not from any desire for secrecy, but from the particular privacy of a woman processing something enormous before she was ready to share it. When she told him, he sat with the information for a long moment, and then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, the expression of a man confronting a happiness so complete that it temporarily exceeds his capacity to contain it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to go make sure the cabin is prepared." And he spent 3 days preparing the cabin with a thoroughness that went well beyond any practical necessity, fitting additional shelving, reinforcing the window frames against winter drafts, replacing the latch on the door with a better one he fashioned himself. She let him work because she understood that for Cormac, Hale building things was how he processed what he felt when feeling exceeded his capacity for language, and because the work made him happy in the particular way of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and why. The boy came into the world on an April morning when the snow was still on the high peaks, but the valley below was beginning to green. Cormac delivered him with hands that were shaking in a way that Audra had never seen. His hands shake steady through everything she had witnessed, steady through the crisis of Fletcher's infection and the 3 in the morning collapse on the mountain trail, shaking now with something that was not fear, but was equally overwhelming. She understood, watching him, that these were hands that had done things he could not undo, and that those same hands were now the first to hold this new and entirely uncompromised life, and that the weight of that juxtaposition was more than his composure was built to absorb all at once. She watched him hold their son and let him feel whatever he felt, and she said nothing because nothing needed to be said. They named the boy Samuel after Cormac's father, which had been Cormac's suggestion, and which Audra had accepted immediately, understanding that it was an act of reclamation, a way of honoring the before of a life that had contained good things before the war had rearranged everything. Samuel was from the beginning an argument against any notion of fate as fixed. He had his father's size and steadiness and his mother's precision and quick attention, And he had something of his own that belonged to neither of them, a particular bright certainty, as if he had arrived in the world already confident of his place in it. 4 years after Samuel, there was a daughter. Audra had not planned to name her Rose, but when she was born, in the first week of October, the same month in which her mother had stumbled through a mountain storm and found a lit window and knocked on a stranger's door, it seemed like the right name, something that could grow in unlikely places, something that had thorns, but also this. Rose had her father's blue eyes and her mother's straight spine and her Uncle Fletcher's stubborn optimism, and the combination produced in Audra's assessment a genuinely formidable person. By the time Rose was 4 years old, she had her own opinions about most things and was not shy about expressing them. And Cormac, who had built his life on the merits of plain speaking, found this not difficult but simply familiar. The cabin grew as the family grew. Cormac added a second room the winter before Samuel was born, working through the short winter days with the same focused intensity he had used to build the original structure. He added a porch extension the summer Samuel turned 3, so that summer evenings could be spent outside, with room for everyone looking at the mountains, doing their slow daily business of light and shadow. He built furniture with increasing skill and occasional beauty, a rocking chair for Audra, that she used every day, a writing table for the corner where she kept a ledger of her quilting orders, because she had begun quilting. It had started as a practical solution to the accumulation of fabric scraps from years of sewing, but it had become something else, something that gave her hands the creative occupation they had always sought and gave her work a dimension that went beyond the functional. She was good at it, as she was good at most things she turned her attention to, and the word spread in the particular organic way that word spreads in isolated communities, and people made the journey to the cabin specifically to commission quilts from Audra Hale. She kept her mother's sewing box on the table where she worked. Every day she opened it, and every day she used the needles and the scissors with the crane handles, and every day the weight and smell of it was her mother's hands and her grandmother's hands, and the long, quiet thread of women's work that ran back through her family like a vein of silver through mountain stone. She did not think this was a small thing. She thought it was perhaps one of the largest things. The nightmares came for Cormac less frequently as the years passed. They had not quieted entirely, and he had not expected them to. They had simply become something he knew how to move through rather than something that moved through him, and the difference, while not dramatic, was real and cumulative. When they woke him, she was there. She did not ask him to describe them or to analyze them or to arrive at any particular resolution about them. She was simply there, her hand on his back, her breathing steady in the dark, and the steadiness of her breathing was the thing that brought him back from wherever the dreams had taken him. He had told her once that this was the most useful thing anyone had ever done for him. She had said it was not a useful thing, it was just the thing you did when you were there. He had said, "I know. That is what I meant." On a morning in the autumn of the 10th year of their marriage, Cormac woke before dawn and found the cabin full of the particular sounds of a household in its morning state. Rose's voice carrying from the loft above in the determined way of a child making her position on something abundantly clear. Samuel's lower voice responding with the patient exasperation of an older sibling who has had this conversation before and expects to have it many times more. The smell of coffee that Audra had started before either of them was awake. He lay still for a moment and listened to all of it. He thought about the morning he had stood at the ridge and said goodbye to the man who used to go there, the man for whom that high place had been a reminder of what he deserved. He had not been back to the ridge since that morning. He thought about it now, not with any urge to return, but with the simple recognition that the place still existed and that his relationship to it had changed the way your relationship to any place changes when you no longer need it to mean the same thing. He thought about the morning Audra had followed his tracks through the frost to find him there. The way she had stood beside him without speaking, without requiring anything from him beyond his presence, and how that quality of company, the kind that did not demand or perform, had been something he had not known to want and had found he could not now imagine doing without. He thought about Samuel, who was going to be taller than him by the time he was 15, and who already moved through the world with a certainty that Cormac had not managed at 35. He thought about Rose and the way animals trusted her, the way she could sit in the clearing for 20 minutes without moving and have a deer approach to within arm's length, which was a kind of competence that could not be taught and could barely be described. He rose and dressed and went to stand beside Audra at the hearth where she was tending the coffee. She handed him a cup without turning around, which meant she had heard him cross the room, which meant she was paying attention in the way she always paid attention, registering everything without making a production of the registration. He took the cup and stood beside her, and they looked out the window together at the clearing in the early morning light, the frost still on the ground, the first thin gold just beginning on the highest peaks. "The children are awake," she said. "I know," he said. I could hear Rose making her case for something from halfway across the clearing. "She wants to come with you when you check the trap lines today. She is 6. She is very certain she is ready." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the clearing. "She probably is," he said. Audra leaned against him slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the window in the thin, cold, perfect October morning and watched the light move down the mountains toward them. "Cormac," she said. "Yes." "Are you all right?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not as a pleasantry, as an actual inquiry from a person who understood the difference between functioning and being all right and wanted to know specifically which one was true. "Yes," he said. "And then better than all right, I am." He paused, searching for the word with the care he applied to things that mattered. "Grateful. I think that is the right word. I wake up in the morning and I am surprised by how much there is to be grateful for. And I am aware that this is not something I manufactured or arrived at through reasoning. It is simply what is true." He looked at the mountains. "I did not know it was possible to feel this way. I had no reference for it." She was quiet for a moment. "You deserved it all along," she said. "You just needed someone to show you the door." He looked down at her. Her dark hair had threads of silver in it, now barely visible but present, and her face had the fine lines that years of mountain weather produced, and she was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had seen in all his years of watching beautiful things in this place. "You came with a fever and a prayer," he said. "Yes," she said. "I answered both." "You did," she said, "before the night was through." Inside the cabin, Samuel said something to Rose that produced the particular outraged sound that Rose made when she felt a fundamental injustice had been committed. And Audra looked at Cormac, and Cormac looked at Audra, and the look that passed between them required no translation. They went inside together into the warmth and the noise, and the living, ongoing, imperfect, irreplaceable life they had built from a storm and a fever and one word spoken in the dark. Behind them, the lamp burned in the window. Audra had lit it before she went to bed the night before. She always did now, had done so every night since the first winter she spent on this mountain, the winter she understood what it meant to keep one burning. Someone out in the dark might need to find their way. That was what it meant. That had always been what it meant, and it always would be.